Welcome to today's webinar in the Zooming In on Migration series. This session is hosted by the H2020 project Advancing Alternative Migration Governance, abbreviated as AdMiGov. And from the project title, you can conclude that we as researchers would like to make a moderate contribution to a better migration governance. I'm Anja van Heelsum, the coordinator of AdMiGov from the University of Amsterdam. And I'm replacing Julien Jean Desbos, the leader of Work Package 1, whose child got high fever today, unfortunately. For those of the listeners who are particularly interested in Julien's work on our project, please visit the project website, admigov.eu, where you find research papers and in a few weeks from now also a MOOC, that's a video about the research that he has led. This is the third webinar in the Zooming In on Migration series. The series is organized jointly by EU-funded Horizon 2020 research project on asylum and migration. And besides AdMiGov, these are Magic, Mignex, and Traffic. The series aims to share and expand our collective knowledge base on the most pressing issues and dynamics in the field of asylum and migration, including internal and protracted displacement, asylum and migration crisis, refugee-driven solutions, and alternatives to current migration governments. Its ambition is to facilitate evidence-based discussion and action in multiple levels. This session focuses on access to Europe and the entry governments in the European Union, which is our Work Package 1 of AdMiGov, sorry. We are pleased that nearly 700 participants have registered for the series. And we will now go ahead with the subject of Work Package 1 of our research. So the entry governments into the EU and Schengen states. Some technical information for the public. This webinar will be recorded. In addition, the webinar is broadcasted live on YouTube for the first time in the Zooming In on Migration series. Attendees can ask questions through the Q&A functionality of Zoom. It is possible to post comment on the YouTube channel of the webinar series, but this will be not be monitored during the event. So let's start with our panel discussion. I'm happy to introduce three AdMiGov researchers: Polly Pallister-Wilkins of the University of Amsterdam, Patricia Matus of the University of Wrocław in Poland, and Martin Lambert-Petersen of the University of Aalborg in Denmark. Then we have Luca Licci, who works at the Directorate General Research and is the linchpin between research on migration and the other directorates of the Commission. He's not responsible for the policy on migration or for the new EU Pact, but he has a role of forwarding research messages into the policy-making system and translating policy into research requests. So, yeah, he is not a politician, but a researcher. So we'll now have 3 rounds of questions. I will first give the researchers the chance to give some information related to their research, and then Luca to react. Then we'll ask them to respond on the question of how their research could... I'm sorry, I'm getting disturbing technical things. Well, we'll have 3 rounds of questions. I will first give the researcher the chance to give some information related to the research and Luca to react. Then we'll ask them to respond on the question of how their research could contribute to good migration governance. And finally, all panelists can choose questions that they'll find in the Q&A section. So let's start with Polly. Polly, you have looked at how entry governance takes place operationally at the EU sea borders, with a focus on the Greek island of Lesbos. Now, your research wrapped up before the pandemic, but you outline a very important role that health governments played already at the time of your research on Lesbos. could you develop for us how health governments and migration entry governments are joined up?
Sure, and thanks, Anja, for that question that Julien Jean de Boa, my colleague, sent me last week. So I've had some time to prepare. And I'd just like to say hello to everybody watching, hello to all colleagues, and sorry that we're having to do this on Zoom, but this is the times that we live in. So in responding to the question about how health governance and is related and links to migration or to entry governance, we have seen that these aspects, these things, health governance and migration or entry governance, have been joined up for a long time, or for quite a while now, for the last 10, 15, 20 years, especially when it comes to the granting of asylum on health grounds. We've seen that increasingly access to healthcare has been one of the ways in which individual member states have been making asylum decisions. And we have certainly seen this joined up approach entry governance and onward mobility context for a while now, or at least in the last 5 years, even before the new Pact on Migration and Asylum, which we will get to discuss a little bit later, where it specifically talks about health screenings as part of entry governance, which I think it is important to question at this stage as researchers who are interested in entry governance, as to whether these health screenings will be used for inclusionary protection purposes or as grounds to exclude people for entry. However, now I just want to sort of briefly focus on how health governance relates to the case of less specifically, both pre-COVID, but also touching a little bit on what has been happening during COVID as well, because this is also an aspect of our ongoing research in AdMiGov. So pre-COVID, health, or what are sometimes called medical vulnerabilities, make up part of the registration process in the hotspot of what was Moria. And these determined both your place of residence on the island often, so possibly not in Moria, for example, but in Karatepe, and or your ability to move off the island to the Greek mainland while waiting for your asylum decision. So this is the geographic restriction that confines asylum seekers to the Aegean Islands until a decision is made on their application. But it does not apply, or it can be lifted for certain vulnerable cases, including specific medical vulnerabilities. However, these medical vulnerabilities are extremely limited and do not cover the largest possible medical vulnerability of all, and that is those with psychosocial needs. And psychosocial needs, we see, are made worse and exacerbated by the poor conditions of neglect that asylum seekers have been subjected to in places like Moria. And these poor conditions have also led to a number of other areas of concern, with the lack of, for example, adequate water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities, meaning widespread instances of scabies and numerous gastrointestinal problems. Additionally, the overcrowding and inadequate safety measures have seen, as we know from 30+ now years of research into the experiences of refugees, problems with sexual and gender-based violence. However, if all these vulnerabilities were taken seriously, everyone would effectively need to be allowed to leave the island. And so they are effectively ignored, and they make the EU-Turkey statement and the EU and its member states complicit in creating specific harms for the asylum seeker population on the island. I'll leave it there. We were told only to be very brief, but I'll move now on to COVID times and what has been happening with COVID. And of course, health governance continues to play a role, as you would expect, a very important role. But in ways that have altered the landscape slightly, while maintaining the logics of governing through specific medical vulnerabilities. So we now see added quarantining for new arrivals and for those who have tested positive for COVID-19. And following the destruction of Moria, there are a growing number of cases, which is extremely worrying, as well as an increase in those who have moved to the mainland and out of Moria due to pre-existing conditions that made them vulnerable to the virus. So this is very interesting. Mobility off the island has actually increased during the Greek lockdown, which might seem counterintuitive, but is in line with governing mobility through health. And additionally, during the general lockdown, the whole of Moria's population became effectively one large community of risk, as social distancing, of course, was not possible due to serious overcrowding, and there was inadequate water and sanitation. So in this sense, the threat of the pandemic was effectively used to create a closed camp policy, which is something that the new Democracy government in Greece has been aiming for and had been aiming for earlier this year, pre-pandemic. So I think with these sorts of issues in mind, both pre-COVID and during COVID, we see how health governance, issues of medical vulnerability, however limited they might be, play an important role, not only in initial entry governance and initial screening regimes, but also in how people are able to move off the island or the conditions within which they live while they are awaiting their asylum claim. And I will stop there.
Thanks very much, Polly. Your subject is really very up to date in the news, so it's highly relevant. Let's go on with the land border story. I mean, we had in our research the land border, the air border, and the sea border. This was the sea border. And Patricia Matus of the University of Wrocław, I want to ask you, you've looked at this entry governments and how it takes place operationally at the land borders with a focus on the Belarus-Poland border. How does the specific operational context of the land border impact EU entry governments, and particularly when it comes to refusing entry? And by this, I mean to ask about the fact that the land borders are the only type of borders where there is literally a country on the other side of the line, and how this impacts patterns of pushbacks and detention at the border.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Anja. Yes, indeed, we did our fieldwork and our research on the Polish-Belarusian land border in Brześć-Terespol, which is a very particular place and well known also from different reports and research. And this border crossing became a symbol of the radicalization of Polish government approach toward people in need of international protection. There have been a lot of attempts of pushbacks, mainly towards the Chechenians asking for international protections. So by Chechenians, I mean the Russian citizens having the Chechenian ethnicity. So in this particular case, many of those people were facing the severe refusal of entry before they finally were able to submit an application for international protection. It has been reported by the human rights organization as well as international organizations. And during the participant observation on the border, we have been facing also this kind of situations. I would add some broader picture to fully understand the situation of Poland, because Poland has been going through a very rapid inflow of migrants starting from 2015, which was important because this high inflow of mainly labor migrants from the neighboring countries started in Poland at the same time when the European Union has been facing the migration crisis. So we had the very hot political debate about migration. On the one hand, about the legal, let's say, labor migrants. On the other hand, about the refugees. So this political debate caused two situations. On the one hand, the very liberal approach towards the labor migrants and very, I would say, protective approach toward the people in need of international protection. So it happened at the same time. But what we have been facing was kind of political debate which was very polarized. On the one hand, as I said, there was this push toward a better control and prevention of undocumented migrants or even people in need of international protection. One of my interviews in the field work said something, I quote, "It was a strong pressure from the government to protect the border. In my opinion, it was the reason why it was more and more difficult to apply for international protection in Poland. Even if the policy is not explicitly formulated, you can feel this pressure on the border." So it's something what happened in this particular place. Another point which is of high importance in my opinion, even there was many reports organization talking about the pushbacks practices on the ground, and at the same time, even with many reports from the NGOs and European Court of Human Rights, and even after the ruling, which was from the beginning of 2020, and the ruling follows long-standing concerns, rights over the situation at the border between the Belarus and Poland, where the Polish guards have been accused of illegitimately refusing entry and for the people coming from the Belarus. Even this didn't impact the situation at the border, and we still have the reports of the daily practices of refusing people the right of asking for the international protection. So this is something which is in very practical sense show us that even the European regulations, even the policies which are on the international protection and human rights, doesn't mean that the people who were in need of international protection are able to go through the procedures which are written in the law, because on the border you just need to have the first contact with the border guards who are responsible for your application, which was our main recommendation from the report, that it should be other independent body which is responsible for dealing with the application, and not the border guards, which are in the sense meant to be a protector of the border. So this is the case of Brześć and Terespol and the border, the land border between Poland and Belarus. So I'm going to stop, because same as Polly, I can talk for hours about my case.
Thanks, Patricia. That's really interesting. Also, the comparison between the land and the sea border. Let's now go to Martin Lemmer-Pedersen. You have looked at the political economy of entrance governments and the role that commercial actors play in shaping EU measures, and politically related particularly to border management. In what direction and with what priorities does the involvement of these actors drag the EU entry governments, and how substantial is their impact? By this, I mean to ask whether EU policies would have gone down a different route without the involvement of the commercial actors. Martin.
Yes, thank you, Anja, very much. And also thank you for my esteemed colleagues for their interesting presentations. And of course, Julian's interesting work on the air borders too is missed, but that's what happens when children get fever. We wish him the best. So thank you for your question, Anja. Well, it's difficult to answer what kind of route would have happened without the involvement of commercial actors, because that's a counterfactual question and not the one that would underpin current realities. And that's actually part of the the approach that that deliverable 1.3 here in AdMiGov set out to address, which is to ask the question, which technologies underpin land, air, and sea borders, and more specifically, what kind of public and private partnerships formulate technologies and the norms embedded within these when it comes to EU entry governance and border control. So asking this kind of question is the same as asking or looking at entry governance and border control as a market. This also means asking in a way into the pre-implementation phase of border politics. That is to say, what are the actors, interests, and networks that co-formulate policy at the EU level. And here we then look at a situation where we have a market for EU border control, which is actually extremely multi-sectoral. But it is dominated by large conglomerates from the security and defense and ICT industries. When I hear Patricia and Polly talk of their cases, it really resonates with this multi-sectoral point, because although, as our report documents, these large conglomerates are very influential when it comes to the databases in the visa information system, the Schengen information system, Eurodac, and so on. At the smaller level, at the local and regional level, we have lots of contracts, lots of private companies engaged in, for instance, returns in the Aegean Sea, or as we have seen at Malta, the contracting of different kinds of vessels where boat migrants are then contained. So it is truly a multi-sectoral market. But if we lift for a moment, elevate the inquiry to this larger level, then we can see one way in which these larger security and defense industries impact EU policies, and that is looking at framework programs, FP6, FP7, also Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe, because they participate in large consortia alongside academic institutions also that develop the technologies of border control, of border surveillance, of border monitoring, and also of channeling of different kinds of migrants. So what we increasingly see is that this kind of commercial interest features in a lot of pre-implementation design of border control by an increased focus on the uptake of border control technology, such as patents, business ventures, and pre-commercial procurement processes. So I think the commercial influence on the multi-level governance of the EU's entry policies needs to look at how there might be a tension between fundamental rights as perceived as politically correct and salient to comment on by a lot of these businesses, but at the same time also not necessarily providing a competitive advantage when it comes to policy drives that concern and revolve around restrictive border control measures. If we look at the renegotiations, the recast proposals on Eurodac, visa information system, Schengen information system, and the entry-exit system, the reason given for data retention periods, lowering age of biometric registration, and different kinds of interoperability is something that resonates with a political priority to well, restrict access to European territory and accelerate exit policies, that is, return policies. So we're seeing a lot of framework contracts on these database systems where a lot of the larger corporations in the ICT sector in Europe are bidding in and are framing and formulating their contract bids according to this political priority. However, the overall rationale of interoperability, that is linking the different databasing systems, risk being used to conflate very distinct phenomena like migration management, internal security, and also the fight against terrorism. So interoperability in this kind of marketized discourse that resonates with current policy drives risk being portrayed as an apolitical and purely technological development, but it cannot be separated from the political and legal context in which it is implemented. So the last point I want to make, as to not take up the time in this round of questions, is that once we observe the pre-implementation phase of how actors feature in the multi-level governance of EU entry, then we look at how it becomes clear how national economic and commercial interests have been a mainstay throughout development of the EU entry governance. And this means that we need to address certain debates about the opaque and spiraling costs of these systems, and also how the same group of conglomerates seem to be harvesting many of these larger framework contracts.
Thanks, Martin. That your approach is very original, and I'm happy that we can see the whole picture together with the political economy besides the actual operational activities on the two borders that we have looked into. Now, I would like to go a little bit further because we have called our project Advancing Alternative Migration Governance. And now I would like to ask the three panelists the question: how do you think your research can contribute to a good migration governance? After that, Luca will react, but let's see what Polly could reply to this.
Okay, thank you, Anja. I've set up my reply to this answer by looking at the new Migration and Asylum Pact, the new Pact on Migration and Asylum, because I think it's quite an interesting way to think about how we might contribute to advancing alternative forms of migration governance. And in looking at this new Pact on Migration and Asylum, like many things, the devil is in the detail. And I think that's what we see also from our research in AdMiGov and research elsewhere, that when you look at realities on the ground, these are often in tension or they contradict attempts by multinational organizations like the European Union or state agencies to better manage, in inverted commas, migration. But when I say that the devil is in the detail with this new pact on migration and asylum, I think what we are actually not seeing is details of how the EU envisions these so-called changes to work. And I would question, in some ways, what is really new here with this pact on migration and asylum in a number of ways. And I think these speak actually to how we can think about advancing different forms of migration management, if that is even something that we would want to do politically. And in the preamble to the pact, there are claims from the Vice President for promoting our European way of life. It's such a revealing name, that Margarita Schrinas, who says that, and I quote, "Moria is a stark reminder that the clock has run out on how long we can live in a house half built." But I want to question who built Moria in the first place. The hotspot approach was all the rage 4 to 5 years ago. So what has changed? And what is meant by half built? Because the proposed so-called changes are just, to me, as I read them, more Moria. If we think of Moria as being more than an architecture, more than a camp, more than a carceral space, but think of it as a rationality for governing entry with humanitarian protection concerns tacked on. In part, these humanitarian protection concerns have become tacked on because of the carceral nature of the space that generates additional protection needs and risks to the well-being of the displaced population that are resident there. But when I say that Moria, when I say more Moria, what do I mean by that? So let me focus on 3 issues. that I think are important for entry governance, as we have, or I have studied it in this AdMiGov research on entry governance at sea borders. And these three issues are screening, faster procedures, and third country cooperation. And so firstly, on screening, the Pact proposes pre-screening. And what is this, right? And looking in detail at the question and answers online, I'm still not really clear what this is. I'm not clear where this takes place. As a border scholar, this is incredibly important. Does this take place within the EU or external to the EU? And if it takes place externally to the EU, who carries this out? There is very little information on how this is to be carried out, for example, in third countries, or how this differs from the visa regime, the existing visa regime, or strict carriers liability in place, that also is a form of pre-screening, and that supposedly does allow for asylum requests to be made to airline and transportation staffs external to the EU, but that our research over many years has shown are not trained to make such decisions and are afraid to do so due to the punitive nature, both financial and administrative, of the strict carriers liability mechanism for their employers. So how does what is proposed differ from what is already in place? All of which result in irregular migration in the first instance, all of which actually create irregular migration in the first instance. So what we see here is a sort of collective unwillingness to admit that irregular migration is made by our own border policies that seek to exclude people and deny them access to safe and legal routes. And we've had the European Union, researchers, we had 25 years to figure this out. And we know why irregular migration takes place. Academics and projects like ours and AdMiGov have been pointing this out for many, many years. But it is politically uncomfortable, I think, to admit that our own policies have led to the problem we are now trying to fix. And the EU is perhaps too cowardly politically to tackle the xenophobia and racism that insists on these exclusionary policies that are designed to deny most of the world's population the privileges of safe and legal mobility that we in Europe enjoy today. But also on screening, what is Moria, or what was Moria, I should say, if it was not a site for screening those irregular arrivals or those rescued at sea? Its official name is Registration and Identification Center, right? This is screening, no? So people are screened at the Registration and Identification Center, or RICS, as they are known in the parlance, already. So what is new here, and how is it going to be different this time around? So this leads me on to faster procedures. So faster procedures were talked about a lot in the EU, well, not a lot because it was very short, but were talked about in the EU-Turkey statement and many of the discussions that happened around the EU-Turkey statement and the reasons for its coming into existence. And my question here is, how do you achieve, for example, the 12-week procedure that is mentioned in the new Pact? How do you achieve this 12-week procedure and 12-week faster procedure while upholding people's rights to asylum and their rights to appeal? And what happens to this right to appeal, based perhaps on new evidence, if deportation orders are issued alongside a negative asylum decision? So faster procedures have been talked about in Greece, in the Greek context, since 2016, if not before. And yet they failed to materialize, because if we want to take seriously commitments to protection and international law, that is claimed in this Pact, that we do want to take those things seriously, then this is in tension with faster procedures. It can be difficult for people, for example, to compile all the evidence needed for an asylum claim in 12 weeks. We have seen from the case of Greece that accessing legal advice is almost impossible in an already overloaded system, which can also impact on this 12-week limit. And we have seen in our AdMiGov research what happens to the asylum system, for example, during a pandemic, where this 12-week process can also become punitive and prevent people accessing their legal rights. So faster procedures also require considerable investment in resource, money and people, technology, some of the problems of which Martin has already elaborated on. We need more people working on asylum claims. We need well-trained people working on asylum claims. We need increased access for claimants. And we've seen what attempts at faster procedures mean previously, right? We've seen what they mean is that people end up effectively stuck on the Aegean Islands. And it means being stuck in the Aegean and the growth of Moria, for example, from a capacity of just under 3,000 to actually a population of 20,000. So as I say, that the devil here is in the detail. And moving on from faster procedures, but intimately related to them, the Pact talks about increased cooperation with third countries. And as we have seen from Moria and the EU-Turkey statement, this cooperation is necessary for faster procedures that can lead to returns. But of course, this cooperation is in tension with the EU's stated commitment to human rights and non-refoulement. So we've seen the breakdown in faster procedures and subsequent returns because of non-safe third countries. So again, what is new here, and it feels as if in this pact, the EU is effectively trying to sort of square a circle. And I feel that, at least from the research that we have done, without really understanding how these supposed policies are going to play out on the ground, and without understanding the complexity of the situations we're dealing with, but also our own complicity in creating irregular migration in the first place, this is actually not going to work. And we have Moria as proof of that. And I will end there.
Thanks, Polly. That was a good analysis of the situation on the ground and how it relates to the current policies. Let's see what the land border issue, Patricia's study, adds to this.
Hello?
Patricia?
Yeah, can you hear me? Sorry, because there was a, yeah, now? Okay.
Yes.
I'm sorry, there was a short technical problem, so I couldn't hear you. Okay, going back to what Polly said, it's the same case with the land border. I mean, it's not about the regulation and laws that were developed at the EU level and national level. It's more about the implementation and the everyday practices. And in my opinion, and after having the field work at the border and the AdMiGov work package, I would say that for migration, and they react on the different smaller and bigger issues at the border, because in case of Poland, this double role of the border guards, which is responsible for both border control and at the same time receiving the declaration of intention for international protection, is a thing that really made the situation impossible for people in need of international protection. So this is the example of the implementation, which is weak and which made life of people in need really difficult, because, as I mentioned, this pushbacks and everyday several attempts of crossing the borders is something which is not only against the EU law, but also against all kinds of human rights laws that are implemented. I would say it is also important to keep in mind that this kind of issues are not the issues of national states, but this is the problem of the European Union as a whole, because while talking about the Polish-Belarusian border, we should remember that this is the external border of the EU, and the procedures and practices implemented on the ground should be according to the EU regulations. So for me, the understanding of the idea of the EU regulations and the implementations of it are very important. We recommended some changes in the regulations for this particular case, as I said. But in my opinion, this practical and the efficient practices on the ground should be on the focus of the policymakers and the practitioners dealing with the border management. And another thing which came out of our research is the, in case of a Polish border, is the very important role of NGOs in supporting people in need, supporting refugees, being at place with the translations and other support, which of course is not the official structure, but the NGOs played a very important role in helping people in need in this particular place at the Polish-Belarusian border. So this is from my side.
Thanks, Patricia. Let's ask Martin, how do you think your research can contribute to good migration governance?
That's a good question, Anja. Of course, we all think a lot about that. I feel that it can in several ways, but to continue on the point from which Patricia ended here, if we think about entry governance and how it's manifested, then there is really a dichotomy between the practical efficiency and reality on the ground at the land borders, sea borders, air borders, and then from the perspective that our deliverable examined, the sort of abstract managerial technical visions of fast, fluent and smooth border control, which is fed in and sort of peddled through sales pitches by a lot of the commercial companies that provides the technological infrastructure of the borders. And that leads me to Polly's point about Moria, because it was exactly the right question you asked, Polly, and also from my sort of perspective, who built Moria? The politicians, of course, at a certain level, local, common European, but also infrastructural, technological. Moria being a registration and identification facility is exactly a gateway into looking at the failure and the collapse of these sort of managerial technical visions of biometric registration and how it actually fed into creating the horrific and apocalyptic scenes that we saw spanning not too long ago. And Moria has, of course, been a very terrible place for years, long before we saw the flames rising. And so I think that looking at the builders, in a way, screening the screeners, is one way to look at dismantling and really talking about the big dichotomy or the asymmetry between techno-managerial visions and realities for people in need of international protection. This also leads me to a little bit of talk on the Migration Pact. I won't claim to have expertise on all aspects of it, but I have, of course, noticed, also working in AdMiGov on Work Package 2 on exit politics, I have, of course, noticed, for instance, the revised proposal on Eurodac, one of the databases, the biometric database that I mentioned beforehand. And if we look at that aspect of the Migration Pact, I'm not sure it is new at all. The thoughts embedded in the pact seems to rather accelerate an ongoing return drive, which is something that can be observed already in recast proposals of concerning these databases from 2016 and 17, can also be brought back to the EU's joint way forward agreement on returns to Afghanistan from 16, and basically from 16 and 18 and onwards on the spiraling number of joint return operations and Frontex-supported national return operations, which again can be led back to the 2010 charter flights, which has been focusing on Nigeria, but today and now where we see Balkans emerging as a zone for EU returns. So my concern here is, again, keeping in mind the technological infrastructures which underpin this return policy drive, is that we're not really talking about how these technologies are set up to enforce a reality that is so far from the reality on the ground, whether it is in Moria-like centers or whether it is post-deportation in unsafe third countries, which have been conditioned to accepting an increasing amount of deportees because of aid conditionality and other forms of political maneuvers at the EU level. So I think I'll round off by saying that what I hope this kind of research can contribute to EU governance politics is to inform the general public, peers, but also EU policymakers about the causes why they may experience a knowledge asymmetry when negotiating with commercial actors about the shape and form of EU entry and exit governance. Because they may not be able to identify profit-driven rather than expert-driven recommendations. And on the other hand, companies may not have a lot of incentives to provide crucial and fundamental critique of the EU policy drives, as it will exclude them from future contracts. So really we should see EU policymakers, whether commissioners or in parliament and everything in between, as placed at very crucial nexus points between intersecting and powerful institutional, commercial, and national economic strategies and interests. And I think we need to have a conversation about whether this sort of marketization of border technologies can counteract or actually undermine concerns about political sustainability, democratic stability, and fundamental human rights in EU governance of migration.
Thanks, Martin. I'm very curious what Luca has to say after all this. Luca.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Yes, Anja, confirm? Yeah, okay, great. Great, so thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks for inviting me again to this great series. And thanks for organizing it. As I mentioned it last time, it's really great to see Horizon Migration research projects forming a real research community, albeit virtually. We had the opportunity also in the past to discuss how I think that's the best way to reach out to policy circles together, rather than just being a constellation of scattered projects. So really well done for that. And it's also nice to be already discussing actually outputs and findings of AdMiGov. One thing that my policy DG's colleagues often tell me is to invite projects to deliver more results as they go, you know, and not being designed to hold everything until the very end, so to say. And so it's great that after not that long since AdMiGov has started, we're already here discussing results. So right before you gave me the floor, I was just counting the pages of notes I took here, and there's just so much we've discussed, and the three speakers before me discussed. Especially because of, you know, how you really managed to broaden our focus, and from our conversation being simply always about, you know, the boats in the Mediterranean arriving, etc., 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 you really expand our focus and make us realize how, you know, migration governance encompasses various different dimensions: land, air, sea, and so there's so much in it. Maybe condensing a bit into three general points, let's say, that I take, especially from the last round, okay? Because, you know, when we are listening to researchers present their work and the results from the field, that you can only take out your notebook and really take notes of it. When thinking about how to, you know, how can this improve our governance system of migration? then it's really interesting maybe to dig into that a bit more. So the first point that came to my mind was about governance, governance itself. And I think the presentation, especially in the first round, were really elaborate in explaining outputs of entry governance, and how this really kind of unfolds on the ground, which is of course a critical and crucial issue. That's where it, all becomes real. And I know that from the work that you do in AdMiGov, you have also preceded this with thorough analysis of documents and policies that have been put in place. But maybe some of the conclusion that you'd like to reach as regards migration governance itself are ultimately about how these policies are developed. And so the actual development of the policies themselves. So a different layer, a different level than the outputs or the outcomes that we've discussed here. So listening to it, I was wondering if in order to do that, we're maybe missing the more kind of ideational component of governance, of migration governance, in terms of development of policies, the ideas that frame this governance and give meaning to it, shape actions, etc. Because I think any attempt to improve migration governance, make it better, make it good, needs to be done first and foremost at that level. As I see it, at least. And so probably this could maybe benefit the analysis by accounting for this and making it easier to reach this objective. And this links to the second point I wanted to make, as that is about policy. And because of what I just said on governance, if we're here to judge, let's say, from policy outputs and from what happens on the ground, etc., and we discuss the people developing this policy, it really builds, so the people that actually hold the pens of these initiatives here, which ultimately I guess is what we mean by impacting the policy with research, is really targeting these people here. Ultimately focusing on these outputs and outcomes kind of builds a picture of a pretty nasty person, so to say. Someone, if these were the objectives he or she has in mind, they have in mind, it wouldn't build a great picture. And my impression is that at the times there is a sort of a confrontation that gets built up between research and policy, and these two worlds, that starts actually from here, because of course researchers are often deep in the field, and you see often really the dire consequences of certain situations. So it's quite understandable, of course, that you want to bring that back when taking your outputs to such policy circles. But then, making this association that I see at times then builds a confrontation, so to say, by assuming that certain people then working in these circles have certain objectives. And from my experience, I can tell you that is not really the case. And there's a much kind of more complex reality in policymaking that's made up of quite rooted frames about challenges and solutions to migration. And this connects me then to the third point, which probably touches upon issues on the Migration Pact as well, that was quite thoroughly discussed by the previous experts. As I mentioned to the organizers, I'm not going to go in the nitty-gritties of the Migration Pact. That's not my job. I'm here just more to reflect in general terms. And so the third point was about the politics of it. And in some sense, it seems quite almost dry to speak about politics after you hear interventions such as those that really report of conditions in Moria, and in these camps and at the border between Poland and Belarus and so on. But of course, that's the context, and yeah, it's really the context that surrounds the the Commission and the work that we need to deal here in Brussels. I think it was Jürgen Carling that at the last webinar we had, he made this point at the last seminar, saying that there is an issue of democratic accountability that is really felt by political leaders, which is inevitable. And so this is, I think, a starting point when we want to approach certain policy circles, considering this as inevitable. It was said by previous speakers that certain things are politically uncomfortable, and that is for sure the case, actually. And such political difficulties are really the bread and butter, let's say, of circles of decision making of the Commission, for sure. I think everyone realizes that if the political situation across Europe was different and migration was discussed, with great positivity and enthusiasm across all member states, then probably the Commission would be in a different position when bringing forward proposals to member states, which then need to vote upon. So to conclude, where do we go from here? And maybe also this was something that was a bit more missing in certain intervention, is really, in practical terms, how do we build a scenario and a future in which we can actually bring in these results to people working? Are we just going to be overrun by the politics of it all? And I don't think so. I think they play a really important role, and we need to be realistic that they are part of this environment. And to approach this environment, we therefore need to be ready to make certain trade-offs, to be part of this conversation. But there's great space still. And maybe I just mentioned the case of another project funded by Horizon 2020. It was the Resoma project, which worked really hard to bring forward evidence on criminalization of humanitarian assistance at the borders. And this was really a long work that they did throughout their 2 years, collecting lots of evidence, participating to various meetings with people in notably in DG Home, but not only, and really bringing forward their evidence there. And finally, we could appreciate from the Pact that was published that they were actually taking into account. They quote the findings that they brought to them, and they add recommendations on recommendations on the issue of criminalization of humanitarian assistance and how humanitarian assistance should not be criminalized. So this is just one example of really tireless efforts to make this point heard, waiting until the bright window of opportunity was present with the publication of the new Pact, being told many times we're not in a position to deal with this right now, not giving up on it. And finally, of course, this is kind of a very small step, but it's still a starting point on which to build upon. And so I think on this example, maybe I'll leave it here, hoping to have it brought it to a very practical example of how actually research can influence policy and the spaces that there is, despite all the political discussions that frame the work that we do.
Thanks very much. Sorry, I was muted. This is a really interesting discussion, of course, and we'll build on this later on in our work of AdMiGov, because we're going to go on with the structural and the more background issues of policy making in our work package 7, where we will create indicators of good migration governance. And I understand that Martin wants to react very short, and after that we'll like to involve the public. So please put your questions in the Q&A section so that our panelists can react. First, Martin.
Yes, thank you very much, Anja, and also thank you very much, Luca, for coming here and listening and reflecting on the interventions of us researchers in AdMiGov. Of course, having formulated AdMiGov in response to a Horizon 2020 call that was explicitly, asking for policy relevant recommendations, this is this is, of course, also what we expect. Now, I think it's very interesting that you bring up the issue of policy development, and I agree completely. That is, in fact, also what our deliverable 1.3 explicitly focuses on. Of course, we also look at outputs and outcomes, but really what we look at in depth is the complex reality that through which EU entry governance is developed. And here, I think it is crucial and absolutely important that we talk about the lobbyism that goes on at the EU level. There are a number of associations like the European Organization for Security, or at a more informal level, the Kangaroo Group, and different kinds of groupings in the European Parliament through which these commercial actors that I presented in the previous intervention actively influence and seek to develop blurred forums responsible for EU policy development. So this happens, through events, through fairs, through joint conferences, and in a very close exchange also with the Commission and its research service. So I think I agree completely that we have to look at the complex reality of policy development, not just outcomes and outputs, although of course the latter is an absolutely crucial component in order to address also the political and moral implications of policies. I can only encourage EU policymakers to gaze more at research which looks at the heavy-handed effects of lobbyism on EU border control policy.
Thanks, Martin. I would like now to turn to our public, and I'm seeing already 4 questions. If you have more questions, please put them in the Q&A section. Polly would like to answer one of the questions, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Anja. There are 3 questions, I think, directed towards me effectively, and I'm going to try and actually there's 4 which I can answer, and I will answer them, some of them together and some of them separately. And one of the questions is effectively around, okay, so where do we go from here? How do we envisage border management that doesn't result in a Moria type situation? And I think that is where we find ourselves now, or where the EU and member states find themselves now. And with this new pact, they find themselves in a position where effectively Moria is the outcome of all of these types of processes, be it the types of processes that Martin was talking about, in terms of sort of the increasing technical nature, the increasing attempts to sort of technocratically govern entry using technology that supposedly absents the decision making of any type of politics, any type of decision that is a political decision about who has the right to belong in European space. And who doesn't have the right to belong in European space, alongside also some of the issues that Patricia was talking about in, how you actually engage in this type of decision making on the ground, in real time, live, that, has all of the messy politics of discretion, etc., built in. But I think what we also see, therefore, also in the attempts to effectively govern entry governance, at least at the sea borders, and attempt to limit onward mobility from those sea borders to elsewhere within the European Union, we end up with a castle type response that we see in Moria. I am not at all, at least from my own experience of doing research on this particular type of issue for the last 10 years, not at all optimistic that we are going to see anything less than a doubling down on these types of responses. There's also a question around whether or not we see there's a problem, or that expedited asylum decisions may bring heavy workloads and may increase a number of appeals. Of course, that's a speculative answer, but I think if we look to what has happened in the past, that has certainly been the case, at least in the Greek context. And I do think that's why I do think there's attention on faster procedures doesn't actually lead necessarily to faster outcomes, and can only simply effectively kick the can down the road, and again lead to people effectively becoming stuck, waiting in limbo for many years in unsafe conditions. There's also a question about the agentification of border governance and the creation of a European task force that could be used, for example, to deal with the emergency that has been generated with the fire in Moria. And again, I think we've been seeing a move to this over the last 5-10 years, right? And it is part of the technocratic attempts to manage migration. And I think we have to ask what we're attempting to do when we manage migration. What are we actually managing? And why is managing necessarily the correct response to human mobility? Why is a managerial response the correct way to deal with something which is an intensely political process related to incredibly complex global political relations? So I think that's also important to bear in mind, and how we would then, and then what then happens, of course, for legitimacy issues and accountability issues. Again, these are questions that have been raised before, not only with the hotspot approach, but also, for example, with the European Trust Fund in Africa, etc., etc. Where does accountability and responsibility lie, and whether or not you care about the politics of migration as a European citizen, or at least somebody who's resident within the European Union, you should care about accountability of our political institutions. And then there's a final question around that I will answer very briefly around the geographies of entry governance, or the geographies of border control, that very importantly points out that border control just doesn't simply happen at the borderline, at the external borders of the EU, but actually happens, is spatial and temporally disaggregated. It happens, for example, whenever any of us or anybody has to provide an identity document or has to provide proof that they belong. That's why this is incredibly political. And asking whether these processes are enacted elsewhere, in cities like Athens or Rome or Brussels. And I would say that for our continuing research, so this is a plug to stay tuned, our continuing research with AdMiGov is looking, for example, at these other spaces beyond the borderline, especially with issues related to protection. So we have a protection work package, which is looking at issues of protection, not only within European space, not only, for example, at the hotspots in Lesbos, but also in Athens, but also issues of protection along the migratory chain. So in places like Istanbul and Lebanon and Beirut also. So stay tuned for that. So I'm going to stop talking now.
Thanks, Polly. I think you have more or less answered the question, how do you define a successful European entry policy? At least you showed what the complexity is there. The question goes on, the one that lets all migrants in, would that be a successful one? And all and out? Who sets the criteria? And is it successful from the perspective of whom? Martin, do you think you can say something about it, or?
Yes, well, I can try, but
I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think at one level, the easy answer to a very good question there is that it was sort of written in the call to which AdMiGov responded, which is a sort of a strangely both Eurocentric and globalized notion of sustainability, and in line with the New York Declaration. So this was explicitly what the Commission was asking for policy responses to, and that's what AdMiGov is trying to develop indicators to. So in that sense, a successful European entry policy is at a very general level one that is sustainable. And you can argue that the situation in Moria or in Libya, or in the Aegean Sea, illustrates its lack of sustainability in the current constellation. But I think there is just a quick, more fundamental point that I think is crucial in order to address the issue of sustainability. And that connects to what Polly was saying, of course, as well, which is that in European policymaking, and this is both at a national government level, but also at a common European level, there is a tendency to abstract the issue of migration from the complex policy ensembles and political economies in which it is embedded. And I think this means that the policies developed risk very quickly becoming unsustainable. One case in point is the EU-Turkey agreement, and how we can see it has fed into regional and geopolitical developments such as Turkey's involvement in the Eastern Mediterranean, or in Libya, or in the Idlib region. Or in other ways too, before that, this is a policy drive that goes further back of abstracting migration from context, which then makes the ensuring policy outcome very short-lived. The EU's collaboration with Muammar Gaddafi is another example. So I think in order to talk about successful entry policy, we also need to be aware of this underlying issue and tendency and problem that migration is abstracted and treated as something very special and different from a range of other EU policies that affect migration.
Thanks, Martin. I see a question that Patricia could maybe reply to. The question is, thank you for your insightful webinar. I would just like to know, what are your thoughts around the case of Hungary, where border applications are no longer accepted? She would like to know how this pact would actually change this or not.
Okay, sorry. I don't know this particular Hungarian case, but I can. I mean, I don't know what do you mean by this Hungarian case, but it's probably comparable to the Polish one, that the border guards are trying not to accept the application. So you try to control people coming the border and keep them outside of the territory of the country and not accepting the application, because as long as the application is not accepted, the procedure does not start. So it means that this pushback story I told you about, it means to keep people out of the border and not giving them the chance. And even what came out of the interviews, that the border guards are trying to not inform people about their rights and about the whole procedure, and not informing about the institutional system and who is responsible for their application and how can they appeal, etc. So they are the different tricks and different ways of not giving the people in need the chance to starting the application procedure, because of course the border guard shouldn't be responsible for dealing with the application, that they should only inform people how they about their rights and about the way how they apply for the protection. Okay, so if you don't give them the chance to start the application, you just push them back by saying that your papers or your documents are not valid or are not right enough to enter the territory of the country. So it's probably the same case, because comparing the political situation and the migration debate in both countries, Hungary and Poland, I guess it might be the same case of, let's say, protecting the territory of the country by violating we should say it by the violating the rights of people who are in need of protection. So that's probably the case.
Thanks, Patricia. I see kind of follow-up on this question in the Q&A now. Somebody asks very specific, the articles of the regulation. Would this actually be enough, sufficient to cope with these concerns? What do you think?
Can I come in on that? I mean, I think that this idea of pre-screening third country nationals at the external borders, and I question, at least from the work we've done on sea borders, where these external borders actually are. I mean, where are we talking about? I think geography matters here. Are we talking about stationing EU border officers in Turkey, for example, before people get in dinghies to travel across the Aegean? Or are we talking about screening people upon their arrival in the European Union, because that is already happening? So I'm wondering where this pre-screening takes place, and will this? And I don't see enough detail in the new pact as to how this actually changes what is currently in existence. I mean, as I say, people already have the right to effectively ask for protection from transport operators outside of the European Union. And this is so that the European Union is not in contravention of international humanitarian law through the implementation of the visa regime and strict carriers liability. But of course, the people, as I come back to this, the people that are then tasked with making that decision as to whether or not to allow people entry to the territory of the European Union or a European Union state from where they can claim asylum are not trained and are not expert enough to make that initial decision. And we certainly shouldn't necessarily be placing that decision onto commercial companies, which would effectively be what would happen in this case. So, you know, while asylum claims are tied to sovereign territory, I'm not quite sure how, I mean, as a political geographer, how this supposed pre-screening is supposed to work. Or is this a return to the idea that was actually first floated by Tony Blair back in the early 2000s? Didn't think he was going to come into today's seminar, did you? But here he is. He's like a bad smell. He won't go away. What was first implemented or proposed by him, that there would be asylum requests heard or considered in people's third countries, that people would submit their asylum requests to embassies, etc., in their country of origin, which of course was completely critiqued, quite rightly so, by a number of experts in asylum, in refugee issues and migration issues, by pointing out that when people are the types of migrants we're seeing risking their lives to cross the Mediterranean, when people are fleeing political violence, gross human rights abuses, conflict and war, they are not going to wait to put in an asylum request in their country of origin, or maybe even in their transit country, and sit and wait for goodness knows how long, for goodness knows what period of time, potentially in very precarious conditions where they don't have the right to work, they lack legal rights, their children don't have the right to go to school, they cannot access health care, adequate accommodation, etc., etc. So with this idea of pre-screening, I don't see enough detail to understand how this is actually going to work in practice, because it will require, as I understand it, the presence of European border guards, European police forces, whoever we charge with these particular roles, to be present in third countries. And of course, that is, again, up to the sovereignty of those third countries as to whether or not they want to accept those issues. And it does also lead to questions around non-refoulement. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Polly. I see a question that Luca might maybe reply to. someone asks, what role do you see for subnational governments for migration in the EU? Luca, do you have some insights on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think the easy answer to that is it's a great role. Of course, that's where migration takes place. I'm just going back to the question. Yeah, that as I was saying, that's where migration actually takes place, and so the main the translation, let's say, of all of our discussions here in supranational, you know, in interinstitutional settings, and then all discussions here in the Commission, etc., all translates into reality once they trickle down through subnational governance circles and they reach the local grounds. So so I think there's a very easy answer to that, and their role will be crucial in you know, the role is crucial in taking up these policies and turning them into realities on the ground, with often the means that they dispose of, really translating them into practice. So yeah, I think that's
Thanks very much. I think we have time for one last question. I'm finding a question that is about whose perspectives are we taking, and that question comes from somebody in Africa. So I would like, who would like to reply to that? Are we taking the perspective of good migration governments from the European side, or should we always include African perspectives too? Maybe Martin could say something about this.
Sure, I can try. I think that is.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that is actually a very crucial question, and I think it feeds back into what we can call displacement epistemologies, which underlie the very ways in which we think of, talk of, and thus analyze issues in migration politics. And here we see, I'm afraid, and also in a lot of EU governance, but also in a lot of national governance, the sort of the recycling of a family of very generic concepts that are very abstract and are recycled across a range of different and widely different sometimes displacement contexts. So we should always ask, as researchers, as EU citizens, as policymakers, we should ask about both the generality, but also the political implications of the concepts that we use. And what is good governance? Well, in the academic literature, there are, of course, critiques of governance as an apolitical term. The way in which AdMiGov researchers use it is in a way more critical, or at least allows for the opportunity to open up and look at good governance through the indicators that we are trying to develop, and ask whether or not certain policies are good in the sense of sustainable, in the sense of protecting rights, and also in the sense of reflecting the perspectives of also non-EU citizens and also of non-EU governments. And I think at a range of issues, such as what both Patricia and Polly have been talking about, collaboration with non-EU countries, that's a very crucial question to ask, because if EU countries, member states bilaterally, or the EU at a supranational level ties the acceptance of readmission agreements to aid or development contributions, then you can ask whether or not third country governments are really freely accepting to join in certain EU policies. So I think the question of perspective is absolutely crucial, and we always, researchers and policymakers alike, have to be very aware of the Eurocentrism that often sort of permeates the kind of conceptual frameworks to which policies are formulated.
Thanks very much, Martin. This is an important point that we need to make. I want to close the discussion now. I think we have many interesting comments by the audience and also many interesting replies by our speakers. Thanks very much for joining our discussion, also to the speakers. And the next Zooming in on Migration and Asylum meeting will be on 27 October and hosted by the MAGIC team. It is called Comparing Crisis, Lessons from Migration Crisis in the European Neighborhood. So please watch the next webinar and see how we are going ahead with this discussion about good migration governments and about the crisis aspect of it in the next session. Okay, I would like to say goodbye to our public and thank you for joining, and hope to see you in the next webinar. Thanks.
Bye.